denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from the back of an unmarked car and with a burlap sack over my head, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll dive deep into a life of crime. Our scene opens on a pair of headlights cutting through the night along a lonely road in the countryside. The two men inside have been sent on a very peculiar errand, which involves a very peculiar delivery. One of the men is getting fidgety. He can sense that something isn't right with this job, but he can't quite put his finger on what it is. This story is called The Man for the Job and was written by A.G. Hilton.
The night was silent. As shadows fell on hill and field, all settled for rest. All save a nondescript van, which trundled its lonely way across the wooded back roads. It came on, its headlights disturbing the darkened quiet. Then the silence resumed its reign as soon as the taillights faded from view. Jimmy Tate couldn't take the silence. They'd driven on without a word through roads more potholed and pockmarked than the face of the moon for nearly an hour. Normally, this wouldn't bother him. Normally, this was preferable. But with all that had happened lately, he felt unsettled, fidgety. At last, he spoke up. "You got any idea why we gotta go through with all this shit?" "Nope." Jimmy gave his companion a glance. Damian Kaminsky's face looked to have been carved from granite by a student unfamiliar with the medium. The result of many brawls, his hooked nose bent to the right in a way that made it seem a piece of it was missing upon first glance. His dull eyes studied the dusty road illuminated by the truck's high beams from beneath a forehead flat as a cliff face. In all, he gave off his usual unbothered air that might best be associated with weathered stone. "You're not a little bit curious? Not even with the shake-ups and everything?" "I'm not paid to be curious. Neither are you. Never knew you to be one to get in your head about stuff." Jimmy scoffed and looked out the passenger window. The night somehow darkened further, the overcast sky strangling any gleam of star or moon away. Still, he caught glimpses of movement as some of the roadside trees, which leaned closer than the rest, appeared to almost caress the vehicle. He was surprised to find the sight had him suppressing a shiver. Ever since he got the job, he'd not felt himself. Right now, he was wishing that he was propped up in his easy chair, watching any damn thing that happened to be on the tube while getting thoroughly wasted. Some might think him lazy, but he preferred to think of himself simply as seasoned and deserving of the fruits of his bloody labor. He'd done more than his share of dirty work. Gruesome stuff most of the time, but in the light of the recent change in management, this cloak and dagger bullshit made him nervous. "All I'm getting at is that I think it's strange, the whole thing. Why not tell us what we're hauling? I mean, do you know anything more?" "I know as much as you." "And that would be?" "Bury the package at the coordinates in the appropriate manner and sprinkle it with this," he said, patting a dark bottle at his side. He was very specific about that last part. "And that stuff would be?" "Smells like water to me." "Any idea about why we pour it?" "Nope." "Well, shit, did you even take a look in the package? Got a feeling there's some poor schmuck in there." "Can't. Nailed tight. Besides, boss said don't open it, just bury it." Christ, but doesn't this skeeve you out just a little? Jimmy turned back to the window. Out here in the middle of nowhere? No idea where we're going except for a GPS coordinate? And no idea what we're hauling? If I didn't know any better, I'd say it's a setup. It's not. Blind Joe, God rest his soul, wouldn't have fed us this bullshit and sent us feeling along in the dark. He'd tell it straight. He was a lot of things, but the man was methodical. Had that old world grit. See, he had to fight for what he had, so he understood. Yup. Damien put on his turn signal, despite the absence of traffic on the back road, and guided the truck onto a turnoff which plunged deeper into the forest. Except Blind Joe's dead. I keep telling you, Jimmy, you just gotta keep your head down and get on with things like they are. Can't ask questions. Even Joe would tell you that. Always said you'd go sticking your nose where it didn't belong one day. Joseph Gurecki, a.k.a. Blind Joe, Old Joe, and, in more quiet circles, the crusty old bastard, had helmed the Gurecki family's operations as long as Jimmy could remember. Blind Joe, old even when Jimmy was young, had been instrumental in bringing him into the business and helping him climb to his current position. The old man's passing had been sudden, yet not altogether unexpected. For the past decade, the crime boss had looked like a corpse as he presided over the meetings, menthol cigarette in the corner of his mouth, eyes always shaded by darkened spectacles, which he never removed, and from which his playful moniker derived. Given this condition, one seemed equally correct in assuming that the old codger was about to drop over at any minute, or that he may never quite give out. Still, Jimmy wondered if the old man had passed as peacefully as was said. He didn't trust this new head prick, a nephew of Blind Joe and more playboy than businessman. Wouldn't be surprised if he'd gotten greedy and snuffed the old-timer. The new boss had made it clear things were changing with the regime. They were cleaning house of Joe's more loyal followers. Jimmy was firmly in the old man's camp. If the geezer was still around, he wouldn't be doing this grunt work, but he'd not breathed a word of discontent to anyone other than Damien. He'd served not just Joe, but the Gurecki family in general for a long while, and despite having kept quiet with his own feelings, and having become considered an asset when it came to making things or people disappear, he wouldn't have been surprised to wake up to a silenced pistol in his face one of these nights. Lately, guys who expressed doubts with the new program tended to go off on jobs and not turn up again. That's why this mysterious business made him nervous. "How much longer we got?" he asked, leaning over to look at the smartphone sitting in a holder on the dashboard. "We're here." Headlights illuminated a rickety fence which had collapsed in several places. Beyond it, high grass swayed around dark, stony lumps surrounding a rickety building. The clouds broke, and by the moonlight, Jimmy saw a crooked cross atop the structure. Stomach crawling, he realized what the stony lumps were. "What is this, some fucking April Fool's prank?" Damien killed the engine, leaving only the moonlight to illuminate the world outside. "Why? You a fool? Promise I won't let any spooks get you." Jimmy didn't acknowledge the slight smile on Damien's face, or his rare show of humor. Never mind any ghost and goblin bullshit. This didn't feel funny to him at all. Leaving the van, each man surveyed the dilapidated graveyard with their LED flashlights. The tombstones threw weird shadows as their beams passed by. Damn it, he was literally jumping at shadows now. Not good. A voice whispered in the back of his mind, "Something's off with you tonight, Jimmy boy. Something's off with this whole thing." Past the headstones, his flashlight lit upon the flaking, bone-white paint of the rickety building. The thing seemed to stand despite gravity. So skeletal it stood that a slight breeze seemed enough to blow it away. Traveling upwards, the beam of the flashlight revealed broken stained glass and finally a steeple, its cross broken and missing. Damien stretched and popped his back. "Your nerves okay with breaking a little consecrated ground? Picks and shovels are in the back. Better get on with it and get back on the road. Gonna be a long night otherwise." Consecrated ground my ass. They'd been at it for a good hour, and though they had a decent start on the hole, the clay-riddled earth resisted them at every stroke. Engine idling in the background, they beat a weird rhythm in the dirt, and the van's headlights threw their shadows across the graveyard. Jimmy unbuttoned his shirt and relished the occasional chill breezes across his bare chest. Damien fared better. Unbothered by the ever-larger stains under his arms, he was someone who actually seemed cheered by hard labor. Now that he was moving, he kept up a steady stream of mindless talk, pausing now and again to swig from a hip flask or light a new cigarette. The talk was driving Jimmy nuts. Where moments ago he'd craved some break in the night's silence, he now wanted to go back to that quiet more than anything. He kept glancing around as they worked. Damien was being too loud. All Jimmy could think of was a silent ambush sneaking up unnoticed beneath the sound of the inane prattle. And something kept pricking at him, making the hair on the back of his neck stand. It was that intuitive sense of being watched. But there was no one here aside from them. He knew this, and yet couldn't help but continue to feel unsettled. The thought occurred again that something was wrong. He almost felt like there was something else he was supposed to be doing. Something that would make things not wrong? Christ, if he could just think for a second! But Damien's prattle kept turning his thoughts off course. Finally, Jimmy threw down his pick and pulled out a smoke of his own. "Fuck this shit. I gotta take a break or I'm gonna stroke out." Damien smiled and dug at the earth. "Whatever you say. By the way, Jim." "What?" "Don't let a ghoul get you." "I'll fuck you." Jimmy puffed smoke and wandered back toward the van, while Damien picked up a tune and began to half-hum, half-sing as he continued to work. This was grunt work, damn it, and meaningless work at that. Why the hell would this thing need to be buried in a churchyard in the middle of nowhere? He'd been with the family for nigh on 2 decades now, and in that time, he'd put to use many more expedient and convenient ways of disposing of things. This was beneath him. For a time, he leaned against the van and watched Damien mindlessly tear at the earth. Keeping his eyes on the big man, he casually fished for another cigarette and strolled to the back of the van until he was hidden from view. There, in the covered truck bed, was the box. It was big, a long wooden crate that made him think of, well, a coffin now that he looked at it. Glancing back at Damien and finding him still hard at work, Jimmy ran his hand over the box's wooden surface and wondered. "Shit!" He drew his hand back. A large splinter protruded from his index finger. He pulled it out, and blood welled immediately, dripping off his extended hand onto the wood. He stuck his finger in his mouth and tasted copper as he continued to stare at the crate. Hell, they might be burying some members of the old order. Maybe pieces of them. The thought made him sick, though not as sick as the sudden, vibrating jolt of movement from inside the box. Christ! He drew back as if stung, and cast another look at Damien. The man was oblivious. Probably couldn't hear it over the idling of the engine and his own singing. There was something alive in this thing. Someone, more likely than not. A couple of faces, other guys who had been brought on by Blind Joe, flashed in his mind's eye. His guts roiled. Holding his breath, he leaned against the box and listened. After a beat of silence, the box shook with another thump. Jimmy couldn't get those faces out of his head. He told himself he was being paranoid, but the thoughts wouldn't cease. He'd just have a quick look. He had to know. If it was some chump, no worries, just another day on the job. But if they were burying one of their own alive? "Hey, when did this become a one-man show?" Damien shouted from the hole. "Settle down, I'm just catching my wind," Jimmy replied. After Damien continued his digging, Jimmy grabbed a spare shovel lying beside the crate and slipped its edge into the small crack between the box's lid and side paneling. With a bit of wiggling, he managed to get it into the crack and began putting more weight on the shovel's handle. The nails groaned and the lid lifted a fraction. He paused and listened, but Damien's shoveling didn't cease. A little more effort, and the corner of the lid was lifted enough to let him see inside. An almost nostalgic smell of menthol hit him as he leaned in with his flashlight. Then the lid was struck from below and came loose. Frozen in shock, he stared into a wrinkled face that would have been familiar were it not emaciated to the point of looking like thin paper plastered to a skull. Gums receded from yellowed teeth, and long canines seemed to glow in the low light. A pale, snaking tongue lapped at the red droplets, which had leaked through a crack in the wood to alight on worm-white lips. Its chest was a mess, owing to a large piece of wood which had been driven through it, an impediment at which long-fingered hands already worked to pull free. But the thing which held him were the eyes. Blind Joe was never seen without his dark glasses, and now Jimmy became one of the few unfortunates to see them, yellowed and slitted like a cat's. They looked at him with inhuman clinical observation, ageless despite the body they inhabited. Having quickly withdrawn the wooden stake, the crime lord's scrawny, ichor-slicked hand grabbed Jimmy with surprising strength, drawing his face down to the back of the van to look the thing in the eye. "That little shit, Gregor. Too prudish to join the blood, and yet still he wants control. Thought he'd bury me away in consecrated ground, Mr. Tate?" A voice came from the front of the truck. "Hey, Jimmy! Quit screwing around back there!" Jimmy stared at those eyes, thoughts breaking away in their gaze. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound came from his throat. "Jimmy!" From the sound of it, Damien was out of the hole now and coming around the truck. "Jimmy, I'm gonna beat your ass if you're back there screwing with that box!" The hollow face held Jimmy's gaze fast as Damien stopped just outside the glow of the van's interior lights. The left door hung ajar, blocking the scene in the back from Damien's view. The skull smiled at Jimmy and nodded, pale tongue licking at fangs. It let go of him. "Quiet," came the voice from the back of his mind. "Jimmy, what the hell are you doing? First you want to get out of Dodge as fast as possible, and then you're messing around on the clock." "Tell him you're coming." The voice inside his head had changed in character. It no longer sounded like him. It was that of an old thing now, hollow and husky. Maybe it had always sounded this way. "Tell him to relax, and that you are coming." "Relax! I said I was coming!" "Follow him." Jimmy felt himself go slack for a moment, and then he marched off after Damien. It felt wrong. The way he moved was as if his own legs had suddenly become strange, as if they moved of a power not their own. But this was inconsequential. He found he wanted to do this. He wanted to do what the voice said, to march after Damien and kill him. The flat end of the shovel smacked the back of Damien's head with a sound like a strange bell. When he went down, Jimmy followed through with more swings. Damien may never have realized what happened until his brain was so much jelly in the hole they'd just dug. Jimmy fell to his knees and vomited into the earth. What the hell had he just done? He tried to stand, caught sight of Damien's legs sticking from the hole, and lost his balance again. He was no stranger to death, nor to the thought of causing it himself. He'd specialized in just that when occasion called for it, as it often had over the years. He'd killed some people who deserved it, but most did not. Never once had he shed a tear over those souls he'd snuffed. But this, Damien wasn't some contract. He was a pain in the ass, but in this line of work, he was family. And yet Jimmy had just beat him to death, just as easy as you please. No, not him. Something else. Something cold and all-pervading. Then it hit him again, a slackening of muscle, and something within him stepping forward to take control. You always were quite good at that, boy. Jimmy stood on unfamiliar feet and turned to the silhouette standing just beyond the headlights of the van. It spoke to him aloud then, and he heard the voice as clear as day. There was no mistaking the old mobster's voice. Quiet now, young one. I knew you'd come through for me. You had little choice, really. This path was planted within you long ago for just such an eventuality. Always were a steady hand, but you never could help from sticking your nose where it shouldn't be. And who would suspect my quiet cat's paw, inquisitive little Jimmy Tate, serving me well until the end? Those eyes flared against the darkness, catching his gaze. Come closer, child. The words carried to Jimmy on foul breath of wind, which at once churned his bowels and sent his head spinning with visions of some distant place, cold, dark, and endless, where long lines of dark figures shambled on to the horizon, carrying unknown loads. He wanted to scream. He wanted to scream and take his chances plunging into the surrounding woods. But he could do nothing. Speechless, Jimmy could only stumble forward and stare at those undying, inhuman eyes which pierced him to his core. A spindly hand patted his cheek. Don't worry, my boy. Your usefulness is not at an end. Even in the afterlife, there are unsavory things which need doing. And as the yellowing jaws came forward, those ageless eyes followed him down into that place of endless cold and darkness.
What a fun mashup! A crime vampire lord! I can pinpoint the moment in the story where everything came into focus. It was the errand splinter that caught Jimmy's finger. When that blood appeared, I knew exactly which type of monster we were dealing with. The consecrated ground narrowed our rogues' gallery as well, but plenty of things that go bump in the night hate that. Well, even I would steer clear of that broken-down church at midnight. Speaking of fun mashups, have you read The City by dear friend of the channel S.C. Mendez? I may be a bit biased because I had the opportunity to perform the audiobook for it, but I think it's also a super fun mashup. It blends detective noir with extreme horror. Our hard-boiled gumshoe Max Elliot takes a case that leads him to an underground city filled with all manner of unsavory characters and activities. Be warned, though, this book really does have extreme horror elements to it, so it's not for the squeamish. But I just love a good genre blend, don't you? If you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the links below. If you'd like to check out another story like this one right away, stick around and have a look at the end cards. I'll put one up for you on the screen. I'll also link the playlist I created called Hilton's Horrors, where you can binge all the stories we've done together so far. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe for more tales like this one. Whatever you do, don't ask too many questions, and don't fall asleep.